Hi everyone, and welcome to Towards 2040 Conversations. My name is Amanda Carl. I run an organisation called The Next Economy, and it's been my privilege to be involved in the background of the 2040 film for the last couple of years. If you're new to the conversation today, it was inspired by a lot of the discussions that were happening around 2040. People have watched the movie, are really inspired, but they want to know what they can do to make the 2040 vision a reality. So we've been having these conversations with a range of Australian-based experts who are working in that space between the thinking and the action, who are trying to actually make this a reality. And today we're going to be talking about the really tricky issues around power, politics, and making change stick. So we've got all the technology, we know we've got the answers, but how do we get over those kind of political barriers that are actually stopping things from happening? Before we get into it, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I'm on at the moment. That's the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, and to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging, and the fact that this land and any land that any of us are meeting on in Australia has never been ceded. And so I really want to recognise that ongoing sovereignty of our First Nations peoples. And I encourage you to find out whose land you're living and working on, and to learn the history of that area as a first step towards understanding and reconciliation. So if you've been joining us for the other conversations, I hope you've been enjoying them and putting some of those things into practice. The conversations we've had so far, the first one was, how do you have a conversation about climate change? So hopefully people have been talking to their neighbours and co-workers about climate change. Last week we did regenerative farming. So how do we change our farming practices so that we're actually giving the planet a chance, as well as making our farming systems fairer. And before that, we had energy justice, which was a really interesting conversation about some of the challenges different sectors of our society are having in the move towards renewable energy. As I said, today we've got these two amazing speakers joining us. I'm going to change the presenter screen so you can see all of us at the same time. So we've got, first up, we're going to be talking to Tim Hollow. Tim is the Executive Director of the Green Institute in Canberra, and Nicola Paris, who is the founder and director of Counteract. So these guys are amazing because they've got a very unique position. They've both worked within the political system as political advisors. And Tim also just ran recently as a candidate in the federal election. So he's had that experience of trying to engage people in the electoral process. But they also have worked outside of the system. So whether that's in drafting policy, or actually organising and training people in direct action. So it's very unique, and I'm glad that I managed to get both of them on the same day into this conversation. We're going to start with Tim, I think, first of all. So Tim, you wrote an amazing Guardian article recently that I really will post onto the website after the chat, which really talked a lot about the system and how people are engaging with it or not engaging with it. But maybe because we've got people with different kind of levels of experience on the call, maybe we go back to basics, like how do we actually engage to try and influence decision makers in the Australian system that we've got? Because most people think they've got the vote, but there's a lot more that they can do. So can you tell people, if you're really passionate about something in the movie and you want to see our politicians take action, what can they do?
Yeah, sure. And that's a great place to start, because this is something that I often talk to people about around the question of democracy. When people think about democracy, they tend to think about voting at elections. That's basically what democratic participation is. But there's so much more to it than that. The first thing to think about, of course, is that there's several levels of jurisdictions that we are governed by across most of Australia. We have local government, we have state or territory government, and we have federal government. And obviously we vote or can vote in all three of them. Yet generally local government is, the elections are kind of the lowest profile, and a lot of people don't in fact vote at them, and we are required, of course, to vote at state and federal elections. But there's so much more to it than that. So we have representative democracy, and we have responsible government. They're the two kind of words, the terms that are used around the way we're governed. Representative democracy being that we elect people to represent us in the various parliaments, in the various levels of government. Responsible government being that the people who we elect to represent us are responsible to us as the citizens for doing what we would like them to do. And that's at a whole lot of different levels. On one level, of course, they're responsible in that when it comes to the next election, if they're not doing the job that we want them to do, we can vote them out. But it also means that they have to follow the laws, supposedly, and they are responsible to us in terms of us being able to lobby them and seek to change policy wherever we can. And that's where things get really interesting, I think. So you elect your local representative, say to the federal parliament. You as their constituent are entitled to go and seek to change their mind about things. And that's one of, I believe, the most important things that we can be doing as citizens, is calling our elected representatives to account as much as we possibly can. There's all sorts of ways we can do that. You can write a letter to your representative. You can email them, you can call their office, and you can seek to have a meeting with them. You can get a group of you together, constituents, to go and seek to have a meeting with your representative and talk to them. And if they're not listening, there's all sorts of things that you can do on that basis. You can obviously seek to get media attention. You can write letters to the papers, call the local radio and talk to them about how the representative isn't listening. Or you can, as Nicola will talk about in much more detail, I imagine, organise all sorts of ways of disrupting what your elected representative is doing, whether it be staking out their office or something like that. So we as citizens have that right, and I would argue we actually have a responsibility to be doing that at all times. And we can dig into how that works and how that doesn't work, and the different ways in which people with different levels of power have the ability to influence decision makers. But it is our right at any time to do anything that we can. And there's all sorts of official channels as well, not just with your local representatives. So often when a government is making decisions, they will have a public inquiry of some kind, or the parties that aren't in government, often, for instance, in the Senate balance of power, will be able to set up inquiries into particular issues. And those inquiries generally take public submissions. So often NGOs or parliamentarians will work quite hard to get information out about the fact that those inquiries are happening, and you can write a submission, and that submission can be anything from just a few lines saying, I really care about this issue, and you need to pay attention to X, Y, or Z people who are making a particular call, or you can write something very detailed, and both of them are effective. You don't need, this is a really important point actually, is that you don't need to feel that you've got to have a certain level of expertise to take part in these processes.
Yep.
Having passion is almost more important for a citizen than having expertise. And it makes a difference. People hear, people listen. Having worked in a parliamentarian's office, I can tell you that when an office is getting a flood of phone calls and emails about a particular issue, it really makes a difference. People sit up and pay attention. They hear it, they see it, and they might not have considered the issue very much, and it triggers them to actually go and find out more, or they might not have realised that the passion in the community was such as it is on these issues.
Yep.
Is that a good start?
I think
is that what you're up?
Yeah, that was really great. Sorry, we just lost you a little bit at the end, but I think that was a really important point, which has actually come up in other discussions that we've had, that kind of old saying that politicians don't lead, they follow, and how important it is you think that these issues are on their radar. But I think we heard with Katarina Gator in the first one talking about climate change, how often she was told that people are not raising the issue of climate change directly with their local MPs, like it's just not coming up on their agenda. So by making more noise about it, it actually makes them look at it in more detail and start to ask some questions around what they need to do about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I was just wondering. So that's a really good overview in Australia. But there's a whole lot of experiments happening around the world with reinventing democracy. So it's still that idea that the people need to be involved and engaged and working with their representatives. But there's some really interesting things happening around the world that I know you write and talk about. Can you talk about some of those things and what they look like?
Yeah, so just I guess as an intro to that, I kind of flippantly said, you know, there's questions of who's got the power to get parliamentarians to make particular decisions, and that's something which is coming up more and more, is that our parliamentarians are supposed to be listening to us as the citizens, as the people who elect them, but more and more they're able to ignore what the citizens think because of the way the power of largely corporations with particular views basically stands in the way of parliamentarians doing what the citizens want. And that, whether that be kind of explicit, you know, small or big C corruption, or whether it simply be that parliamentarians who tend to get elected are the ones who tend to have the support of particular corporate points of view, that is nevertheless happening at all sorts of levels. So there are a whole lot of experiments going on around the world with how do we face up to that? How do we fix that? If our democracy isn't working particularly well as a democracy, if the views of some are being treated as more important than the views of others, how do we fix that? And a lot of people are starting to move towards this idea that democracy shouldn't just be representative. It shouldn't just rely on the idea that we as citizens have the role of electing our representatives and then re-electing them or electing someone else, but that we as citizens actually can play a much stronger and more direct role in democratic decision making. So if you think about, for instance, like I mentioned, you know, a parliament might set up an inquiry into something, or on the planning, planning law, for instance. Generally what happens is a corporation comes in, they decide they want to develop a particular area, and government basically says yes, but they ask the citizens, okay, well, what do you think about this? And everybody kind of knows that the consultation that goes on there is kind of window dressing. Basically what was intended to happen ends up happening. The same thing often goes for inquiry processes. You might have an inquiry that comes up with some very clear recommendations, but it's very unusual for government to change their view on the basis of that. So what about if you actually got out ahead of that? And as the citizens, you started to decide what you want as a community. And there's all sorts of models of that. One that's going really quite well in the whole in parts of the world is the idea of participatory budgeting, where governments, so you know, obviously one of the key roles of government is to decide where taxpayers' funds go, where government will invest the funds that it has. And what participatory budgeting is about is government saying, actually, well, we will set aside a portion of our budget for the community to decide what it wants. This works really, really well at a local government level. In Brisbane, one of the local government representatives, Jonathan Shree, has been doing some really exciting work around that. He takes a chunk of the budget that he's entitled to as one of the members of the local assembly, and gets the community to come in and decide, okay, well, you know, what's the most important thing we think here? Should it be, pedestrian infrastructure or cycling infrastructure, or parkland, or particular pieces of public infrastructure that they might like. So participatory budgeting has really been taking off quite well. And then more deeply than that, there's processes like citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies that are being established, where usually it happens where it's a particularly controversial decision that government needs to make, and they can't quite figure out a way through. So what they do is they select, usually on a random basis, basically a representative random basis, a group of citizens to come together, and they ensure that those citizens have access to expert advice and to expert facilitation, really importantly, so that the conversation can be had in a really constructive way and enable the citizens actually to come up with a path forward. There's been some really very powerful examples of that in Australia. In South Australia, the government set one up on nuclear waste dumps. And in fact, what
Mm.
was interesting there was that both the government and the opposition wanted South Australia to become the site for a nuclear waste dump. But they knew it was controversial, so they set up the Citizens' Assembly. And in fact, the Citizens' Assembly came to a very strong conclusion that they did not want a nuclear waste dump. Sorry, is that chiming through to you? They did not want a nuclear waste dump in South Australia. And the government basically had no choice but to listen and change their mind. And for 10 years, that may be actually on the wane now, but for 10 years, that certainly held off the nuclear waste dump. In Ireland recently, there's been a spectacular example where the Irish Parliament set up a Citizens' Assembly, which enabled Ireland as historically a reasonably conservative Catholic jurisdiction to legalise abortion and to legalise equal marriage in a jurisdiction where the Parliament simply was not going to do that. They simply couldn't do that, but the people wanted it. So a citizens' jury process led them to that. And kind of at the most kind of large-scale model in Belgium now, and they're talking about it now in Scotland too, they're instituting kind of ongoing citizens' assemblies where they'll have a rotating group of citizens who will be nominated basically to sit on this assembly for a shortish period of time. And to take part in setting the agenda, basically setting the political agenda for the Parliament, and getting citizens' input much more directly and upfront. So yeah, there's some really exciting ways of getting citizens engaged in that way, and it does a number of things. Firstly, it really allows the citizens to feel like they're having a say in democracy, because more and more people are saying, well, there's strong views on this, there's great agreement across the community, and governments aren't acting. Part of it is kind of simply a failure of government, and partly, as I say, it's the power of corporations to just get in and get what they want done. Citizens' assemblies, you can't do that. You absolutely can't do that.
Yeah, it's really heartening and hopeful, and it's been frustrating for me that a lot of people in Australia don't know about these things that are happening all around the world, but also in Australia, and that we can actually get more engaged in them. And, you know, people on this call, if there's something that you're really passionate about, you can actually start organising this even at a local level. So there's lots of ways to get engaged.
It's worth saying, actually, that, you know, the examples that I used were all sort of instituted by government or by representatives, but there's some really powerful examples where it's just been set up by citizens who want to do things. And because they've been able to gather enough citizens together and come up with some really comprehensive and strong examples, they've actually managed to build quite substantial political power by doing so. In Spain, there's some really tremendous examples of that going on, and elsewhere around the world. So yeah, if you feel passionate about it, in Italy.
Great. We might move on to Nicola. I don't know if I said at the beginning of the call, but for everybody listening, we really want you to put in your questions. So we've got a good half an hour to just address what you're interested in. So there's a little question tab in the little box that you should have on your screen. So please start putting your questions in there, and we'll pick up as many of them as we can answer after we have a chat with Nicola. So please write them in. So Nicola, yep, you've got your camera on, that's great. So Tim's talking about all these different ways of engaging, but I'm interested in your perspective on what's maybe not working so well with our current democracy. Like, why isn't it working? What's getting in the way of politicians making some good decisions? Because Tim touched on it, but what's your perspective on it?
Sure. I think we have, as I've said recently, I think we've got the idea of a democracy. I don't think we actually have a functioning democracy. And again, like what Tim touched on, was that, you know, often these government consultation processes are going to have a predetermined outcome, and, you know, there's a lot of you know, just very rigid thinking along party lines, and going along with their political dogma, and, you know, just maintaining an oppositional approach rather than a collaborative approach in politics. But I think very functionally where we're at is that our democracy is open to the highest bidder, and that doesn't generally include those of us who maybe are scattered around the country, a lot of people struggling to get by, and they don't have $10,000 to get a seat at the table. And so when you've got corporations that are driving the interests of the country in terms of fossil fuel companies, in terms of, you know, companies that are making large amounts of money from locking up asylum seekers, to any issue really, you know, we've got a sort of a corporatocracy, I guess, and that causes a problem in that, you know, there's so many steps that your average person has got to get through to have their voice heard, and not all of us could pull out the checkbook to get to the table.
Yeah, it was interesting. Recently, I was meeting with a very senior government representative, who I won't say who it was, but it shocked me. I was talking about the future of the coal industry in Queensland, and there's been some really big reports from people like BHP saying investing in coal is a bad idea. And I sort of dropped that into the conversation thinking that they would know that, and some of the other reports that have been coming out saying there isn't a future for the coal industry. And I got an email 2 days later saying, can you send us, do you have any facts to back that up, or statistics or reports? Because we weren't aware of what you were talking about. And I just thought, how do you not know that?
Yeah.
And it's interesting. It's like, who's got the day job to go and talk to the politicians, and who's got the money to actually spend that time to be there and in their ear and presenting things to them? And you've got to have resources to do that, unfortunately. So it was one of those lessons for me.
But I mean, that those people are paid, you know, any senior staffer is, or politician is paid $200,000 to know that stuff, you know, minimum. So they should know it, hey?
Yeah. Who are they going to?
Yeah.
But they do listen when you can get in there, some of the time. So, but what happens? What does happen? So we had Tim's kind of examples of how to engage, and there's some great organisations around the country that are really trying to pull people together and build their capacity to engage with the political system, like Get Up, for example. But what happens when that's not working? What options do we have if they're really not listening and they're going to go ahead in against the well-being of the public or the environment? What options do we have?
Yeah, so that's obviously the area of my work, which is civil resistance. So for folk who are new to that, that's basically looking at change that happens outside the normal political sphere. So it's extra parliamentary resistance, so outside of the political process. You might be putting pressure on the political process, but you're not actually seeking to lobby and advocate to make change. So just to give people a couple of the terms that are typically used, so folk have got some understanding around it. A lot of people will refer to non-violent direct action. So that is basically any action that is non-violent, and that will typically be up for debate within any group who might come to sort of a shared understanding of what they believe to be non-violent. And then direct action. So direct action is when you actually take action for yourself rather than asking a third party or asking a government to do that. So an example of non-violent direct action could be, you know, the more typical example that we know of would be things like, you know, locking yourself to a bulldozer because you want to try to stop land clearing for a coal mine. But other forms of direct action are basically cutting out the middleman. So seeing a need and feeling it and not asking for help or requiring someone else to do that work for you on the way. So a really great example, which I've given a few times, is as a result of the community building that happened after, Occupy, the Occupy movement in 2011, which was large-scale occupations of public spaces around the world, primarily focused on economic justice. And there was a lot of skill and a lot of capacity and a lot of networks built in a lot of places. And there's still groups, actually, even though it was considered a failure, that are functional that came out of Occupy Melbourne, for example, that I was around for. So like it definitely left a lasting legacy and built a lot of capacity and community in some areas. And in this particular instance, the community that had been working in and around the area when Hurricane Sandy came through the United States, they organised and mobilised, and they called it Occupy Sandy. And they basically, where government is very slow and bureaucratic and, potentially waiting for corporate tenders on things, to make sure that their mates get the most money out of things, people on the ground who had that experience and those connections and those logistic skills that they built up by running huge kitchens and getting together medical supplies and looking after people at large scale, that they actually mobilized and got out and looked after those communities. So, they were able to get there quicker because they didn't have all of this sort of legislation and red tape and, tick boxes to check out, when you see these massive aid programs and then find out later that not that much of the money hit the ground. So that's sort of an example of where nonviolent resistance from Occupy and people organising together builds that community and those skills and those networks to allow them to, to get involved in that sort of direct kind of action. And then the other phrase that's used a lot is civil disobedience. So that is a form of nonviolent direct action. And that's when people consciously break a law, risk arrest, with the point of, that being a moral, a principled, an ethical decision, an act of good conscience. So civil disobedience is about actively stepping into conflict, but in a peaceful way, so non-violent conflict, and challenging social norms, being willing to risk sanctions, arrest, imprisonment, very briefly in Australia generally, and that might be to physically get in the way or to draw attention. And we're seeing this, coming out across the country, in particular on climate. Obviously, that's the biggest hot button issue where we're seeing the legacy of a decade or more of organising and building to see some, fairly large scale resistance and some very normalised and mainstream people stepping up where they previously haven't done to try and, put their body in the gears, as people would say, like basically when all you have left is your body to put in the way when the petitions and the asking and the normal processes have failed. That's when people are directly intervening. And so that's what we're seeing, for example, up at the Adani coal mine site and with Extinction Rebellion and with Frontline Action and Coal and with the Stop Adani movement, occupying headquarters of corporate contractors to Adani. So though it tends to be deployed when other avenues have failed, not always, but that tends to be the case. And that's when it tends to have the most sort of moral power as well, because you've demonstrated that you have actually tried other options.
Yeah, and we're seeing it all across the country right now. So there's kind of this scale that we're talking about in terms of having direct influence and talking to your direct representatives, through to try and engage with the system through the different kinds of things that are set up, like inquiries and submissions, right through to then, I guess, naming and shaming, like doing that public focused attention on when things aren't going well or they're not listening, through to then the protesting and then direct action as kind of that last resort. So even some of the, like in the middle section, like the ability to advocate, even engage with like some of the things that GetUp does in terms of campaigns and trying to advertise what's going on, or organising people to even just write letters. So those very legal mechanisms that Tim was talking about have actually come under attack in the last couple of years. We've been seeing pushback from some of our political representatives. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and what's actually happening in Australia that's actually eroding some of those rights?
Yeah, certainly. So the Institute of Public Affairs some years back basically put out a bit of a wish list of the things that they wanted to do, none of which I would generally probably share with them as good ideas for how to enhance living in this country. And on that list, among others, was was sort of targeting the charity sector, and that's been going on for actually. When I was working in Parliament, I was seeing.
Sorry, can you just say that again? You sort of cut out a little bit. So how long has that
Oh,
been
I'm
going on?
not coming through since the
You applied.
Howard years.
Okay,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. So when I was a staffer, I was, seeing the pushback on the third sector, on the community sector. So as soon as you're effective, you get attacked. It's a measure of success. When you're being attacked, it doesn't feel like it, and it takes up a huge amount of resources. And I think that's one of the things that we need to name about these attacks on civil society is that it's done very deliberately to take up time, to take up resources, to cost money, and so that could bring a smaller organisation to its knees. Obviously, GetUp has got a large financial and supporter base, and that supporter base is going to be galvanised when they see attacks. And in fact, I believe has been previously. Organisations tend to get a very good response for fundraising donations, for example, when you actually say this is actually what's happening to us, and people who feel engaged and feel like they're on the team, they want to help out. And so it can be a huge opportunity, but at the time it's incredibly wearing. And so we've seen them going after environmental organisations, and I've sort of seen some of that from the inside with different orgs that I've been involved with or collaborated with who have been attacked, and they are wanting to essentially strip away the right to have a political opinion in this country. And obviously that is not a good thing for democracy. We actually need people to be able to advocate for systemic policy and legislative change, not just, fix up the recycling issue or actually that's a pretty big thing that needs to be fixed up right now, but not just deal with the rehabilitation of bushland, but to stop it being destroyed in the first place. Not just look at the how we deal with climate change, like stop digging up the fossil fuels to start off with.
Yeah.
And as 2040 has shown, there's plenty of ways that are demonstrated and working already. So government's basically coming after anyone who's effective, and that has included large organisations. They've had the environmental sector in their sights for some years now, and the head of the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profit Commission is Gary Gray. Forgotten his name, but he's basically it's like putting the fox in charge of the hen house. He's actually actively said that he doesn't believe in charities in the community sector, so he's been put there to do as much damage as possible. And we've got a Murdoch media that's providing cover for that kind of thing in terms of like being actively involved in these attacks on any groups that are seeking to disturb the status quo. And then we're seeing that all the way down to, for example, Frontline Action on Coal, who are a group that I've worked with and collaborated with over a number of years, and they're being hit with what's called a SLAP suit. So that's strategic litigation against public participation. And, they are being hit by Corporation Horizon, who work with and for Adani, to basically try to bankrupt and destroy an organisation, and they're trying to take individuals with them. So anytime you're successful, you're going to have powerful people and companies come after you.
So some of the things, just to summarise for people who might not be very familiar, so some of the things that they're doing is threatening to take away the charitable status of any organisation that is involved in anything that's seen as advocacy or political. So even though organisations have got charitable status, some of them to actually do that work, but that's being questioned as to whether as a charity you can have that opinion. So anything that you put out in your newsletter or on your website that can be deemed political can mean that you get your charitable status taken away and deregistered. It means legal attacks, so suing organisations, taking them to court, and then the bankrupting of individuals as well as just the drawn out processes of inquiries and things that then cost a lot of money and take up a lot of staff time, so people can't actually do their jobs in the meantime. So there's some of the things that organisations are having to deal with right now.
And also using the parliamentary process as well. So, you know, there was a parliamentary inquiry into environmental groups, you know, and their ability to advocate, and, you know, relating to the charity status issues that you mentioned. So, you know, they're using the resources, the full resources of Parliament and the legislative arm to come after organisations that are active in opposing, you know, their worldview.
And then we're seeing outside of that sector directly, there's just more general sort of trends around cracking down on whistleblowers, and then the things that we've seen recently with journalists, workplaces and homes being broken into, but you know, the Australian Federal Police going and taking files off journalists, off organisations like GetUp, so which are just generally quite worrying trends. So what can we do about that, about the sort of erosion of our democratic right to protest or engage politically? What can people do if they're hearing this and are really concerned? What are the avenues to get involved around protecting our rights?
Yeah, so there's a lot that can be done, and I would say you use it or lose it. You know, like we need to open up the political space that we're operating in. We need to protect and defend people, and most importantly, we need to speak up, even if we maybe don't agree with, you know, exactly what an organisation does, or, you know, a group of people or a group of activists might do. One of the good things actually that came out of the attacks on environment groups several years ago is that there was some really great collaborative work done. And that included like very conservative environmental organisations, you know, right down to organisations that supported civil disobedience. And, you know, there was a commitment to each other very early on that, you know, people wouldn't allow themselves to be wedged, you know, in order to try to draw out and attack each other, and, you know, to try to allow the government to sort of, you know, sow seeds of dissent in the movement. Again, recently the Hands Off Our Charities Alliance last year did some good work in pushing back on some of the really problematic foreign espionage and foreign interference legislation. So, you know, if you are a donor or you're involved or you're a volunteer with any of these organisations, I would contact them and say, you know, how can I help? What are you doing? Like, how are you helping defend this organisation that's under attack? I think that people can, particularly with civil resistance and peaceful protest, what the government is trying to do is to make people scared of participating, and we need to have that as something that spurs us on and galvanises us to continue to organise, rather than something that we allow to, you know, to divide us and to sort of sow seeds where people are, you know, exhausted and tired and sick of, you know, putting up with all of these attacks all that time, and it can really have a huge impact on individuals as well as organisations when all of your resources are being drawn away from the really valuable work that people want to be doing. So taking up political space, you know, when you see call outs, when you see people asking for solidarity, acting on that solidarity, I think in particular for people who are privileged, so people who are, you know, in a position where, you know, white middle class university educated folk, you know, should be using that privilege and voicing when marginalised voices are being attacked. You know, we should be standing up for everyone when we see that. I think a good example you could give is when there was some, you know, like quite disruptive, well-organised action that a bunch of vegan groups did in the cities and elsewhere around the country, maybe a couple of months ago, and I saw like quite a lot of negative commentary about that. And I think that you can have a disagreement about tactics, and we need to be able to have these robust discussions and have debates and, realize that that doesn't mean that we don't, that we dislike people, but, we can have those debates, those conversations about tactics and how we go about things. But at the same time, I'm always going to want to have the back of the people that are under attack. And I just would really, really encourage people to not fall into that trap that, the government and the Murdoch media want us to, in terms of when they demonize activists and protesters in the newspaper. Maybe find out for yourself. You might be surprised at all of the negative things that are being said about people. You might be quite surprised about what that actually does look like in reality, because it's certainly not the extreme awfulness that is depicted.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, I don't know how much people know about the work that I do, but a lot of what I do is very about bringing people together in regional communities around coal and climate change, and working behind the scenes a lot with decision makers around solutions and how we move that forward. So sometimes people think that they just assume that that means I'm critical of some of the more direct action work that's being done to raise attention about climate change and coal. But it's the opposite. It's like, for me to do my job, I actually need people to draw a line in the sand and say, this is enough, this needs to stop, so that people will listen and actually go, okay, well, what do we do about it? Then I can do my work. If those people aren't out there making the noise and pushing the envelope, then nobody's going to take any notice. So it's all part of the same jigsaw puzzle. And I think people forget that a lot of the time.
And I think the left is, or generally any like vaguely progressive part of politics is so much less disciplined and gives our opponents what they want in terms of infighting and critique and criticism, and rather than acknowledging that there is a use and a need for a radical flank, and often that's really helpful for politicians as well. I've met politicians who've said, go hard, that helps us, it helps us look moderate and come up with reasonable solutions when you're out there. You shouldn't be leaving it to the left of the ALP and the Greens to be having the most radical policies. There should actually be people out there that are advocating for a faster transition, and more ambitious programs, because that's going to help open up the debate for everyone else to step into.
Yeah, great. We might bring Tim back into the conversation. And I'm going to change the presenter view just a second. And we can see Tim again. Great. So just before, I've got lots of questions coming through, which is great. But just before we do, so Nicola, if people want to learn more or to start to develop their skills around or understand more about civil disobedience, direct action, where can they go if they sort of want to dip their toe in the water? How do they learn? How do they get involved?
So my website is counteract.org.au, and we've got heaps of resources for people who just might want to learn a little bit more. We've got practical resources if you're setting into action for the first time, so some of the mechanics and logistics and roles and tools that you might want to help you, plus case studies and a lot of examples of successful campaigns. So we've got a lot of resources. On the climate issue, there's heaps of groups that you can get involved with. The Stop Adani network is massive, and probably one of the easier groups to hook in with. But also there is Frontline Action on Coal, there is Extinction Rebellion things happening at the moment. Maybe we'll write up a little bit of a piece with some links for folk who might be interested. And certainly if there's any questions on specific information, I'd be happy to answer that. But that would be definitely some starting points. And in particular, I think one of the pieces that I collaborated with Tim on for the Green Institute did a paper on rebalancing rights, and I contributed a piece on the suppression of protest, and that sort of kind of gives a very broad brush overview of some of the patterns of repression that we're starting to see, and people just simply being aware of that and pushing back and speaking about that is really helpful.
Great. And Tim, if people want to learn more about some of the things that you were talking about? Is there somewhere people can go? Is that too broad a question?
There's all sorts of different places for different things, yeah. But yeah, I would certainly recommend, for things like inquiry processes that are going on. A quick Google search will often find you things, but also looking at the websites of the parliaments. And check out your local MP's website. Your local MP will always have a bunch of things on their own website about what's going on in the local community, a lot of which you may completely disagree with, but you'll find out where they're going to be and where they have been and who they're talking to. And their contact details, the local MP's contact details will always be on their website. And I can't emphasize too much how much of an impact it does actually have. It won't be anything like enough, but it shifts opinions, and particularly on some of that stuff that Amanda and Nicola were just talking about in terms of the suppression of the right to protest and the right for advocacy, and the throwing the book at whistleblowers and things that's going on at the moment, the suppression of democracy. Parliamentarians need to hear from people in the community about how much that is troubling them. Because most parliamentarians and their advisors simply think that that's just kind of standard practice and okay, and aren't troubled by it. So yeah.
I think that people don't care.
Yeah.
As well. Okay, so just get to some people's questions, because I promised you half an hour of questions and we're running out of time. So there's two questions here about citizen assemblies. So Kathy Will's asking, what are the practical steps you could suggest to start a citizens assembly? And similarly, I think it's Martin Dirksen said about in Greece, David Van Raybroek wrote a book provocatively entitled Against Elections. So that was about how you get citizens directly engaged. So practical tips on people want to get something started?
So I guess the thing about making citizens assemblies work is that the critical part of it is to get away from the really combative nature of so much political conversation and so much of our political discourse, I guess. It's about actually processes of deliberation where people can come into a space together with quite different views often, and work through, not even necessarily to get a compromise always, but actually often to come up with creative solutions that people will find that everybody in the room ends up okay with. This idea of consensus decision making, which some people think is about just everybody gets worn down until finally people agree. In principle, it's actually about being open to changing your mind and being open to getting to a position which isn't what you came in with, but that you're okay with at the end. So the number one thing that I would suggest is find yourself somebody who ideally is actually a trained facilitator, but if not a fully trained facilitator, if you don't have someone around, then somebody who's got some experience doing that. You need somebody who's going to be able to lead the room, not in terms of leading where you're going to get to, but enabling open, good, constructive conversation. That's the number one most important thing. There's a couple of really interesting books. The Raybroek one's a very interesting one. There's another one called They Can't Represent Us, by a couple of folks who've been involved in the Occupy movement and Syriza and Podemos, and folks who have gone around the world examining how these kinds of citizens processes work and looking into them. But yeah, really just getting people to that point of feeling like they want to have a genuine conversation about things is the most important part. There's some basics of some of the simplest stuff is make sure you've got lots of pens and paper and things around so that people can be scrawling notes and discussing things and sharing ideas and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, a couple of really good books. What I'll do is I'll send some links for some good how-tos. But yeah, good facilitator is number one.
Yeah, and I think the organisation that did it in South Australia was Democracy Co. I just found out this week, so we can put their link up as well,
Yep.
who are experts in running citizens' juries. There's a few questions here I'm going to clump together because we're running out of time, and I want both your perspectives on this one. So it kind of relates to the systemic stuff. So, for example, one of the questions was from Dean. I don't know how to say your surname, Dean Bierlich. A major political problem in addressing climate change is the long-term vision and infrastructure required, but politicians are working in short-term political and media cycles. There's a similar question around, you know, how do we what sort of systemic changes can we put in place to avoid these types of collusions, conflicts, interests, lobbying, etc. So someone gave the example of a lawyer who presented at the Economics of Happiness conference who had won 4 court cases against the mining industry. But when she won the last court case, the CEO of the mining company flew right into the office of the Prime Minister, and so that it just didn't mean anything in the end. So it's that kind of issue around how do we influence that? What are some of the things that we can start to do to start to erode and undermine the hold that those powerful interests have over the system right now, apart from what we've already talked about, I guess?
If I can start, there's a few obvious policy interventions that people have been talking about for quite some time. At least capping, but ideally over time, banning corporate political donations is it's just one of the most fundamental things that we absolutely have to do. It's extraordinary that Australia federally still does not have an anti-corruption commission. It's just gobsmacking. We desperately need an anti-corruption commission, and we have very, very, very weak regulation of our lobbyists, of who can actually go in and lobby, and the revolving door that we have between parliamentarians' offices and lobbyists' organisations, those kinds of things. Those are obvious. It's extraordinary that they still haven't been done after people having been advocating for them for decades. I actually think that it goes deeper than that, though. I think we have a problem with a system where you have these enormous corporations that under law have essentially the prime obligation to increase profit for their shareholders. And that is their only obligation. They're supposed to follow the law, but they can often ignore the law and they can get the law changed. But they don't have a responsibility to take into account the impacts of their behavior on people and on the communities and on the natural world. I think that needs to change fundamentally, and that will be one of the most enormous tasks for the coming decade, is to shift the way corporations are regulated, because once you have that kind of definition in existence in law, it is inevitable that they come to trump everything else. They're designed to overrun everything in their path in order to increase profit. That needs to change.
Nicola, your thoughts on?
Oh, I think Tim covered it quite nicely, actually. So, you know, probably covered a few of the things I would have said. I think that MPs need to know that we're watching them, and I think they need to know that they do need to be accountable more than, you know, once every 3 years. So what, you know, Tim said earlier as well, is like being active. You know, democracy isn't just putting your vote in at the ballot box once every 3 years. It's contacting your local member. It's like your local member knowing you and going, oh God, it's that person, because, you know, like you call up and you're the one that has got all of these questions and these views, and, you know, like you're an active person in your community. That's you know, actually getting involved is one thing. And for me, the other piece that I'm seeing play out in terms of the realm that I work in is that building community is really key to coming up against these huge challenges, you know, when the odds seem overwhelming. And that's what I actually think is one of the kind of lesser known and the loveliest sort of side effects or results of non-violent direct action and civil resistance, is that there's a sense of community built in people that have struggled together that you can't replicate in any other way. And for me, I'm seeing that play out here back in Western Australia, where I supported the campaign to stop the road going through the wetlands here. And, you know, a whole heap of people who were activated in that campaign a couple of years ago are now active in Extinction Rebellion because they got a sense of their own power, and they got a sense of what is possible when you do challenge the status quo and when you do challenge the political system, when you have run out of options and you put yourself in the way. So my recommendation is putting yourself in the way, being a pain in the arse.
And also with the people who want to take a step before that, I think everything that we've been discussing, like for all of the chats, is what I'm seeing is really exciting for me over the last 9 years that I've been involved in around climate issues, is how people go from joining a community garden, for example, and then trying to, you know, they've got this beautiful garden, and then council slaps some sort of regulation in the way of that, and then they take it to the next step and they go and visit their MP, and then that can either work or not work. And then they'll take it to the next level. And the next thing, you know, see people end up running for elections. And I guess that's what we're seeing with the independents sort of starting to emerge as well. Like the Indi campaign was, you know, there was a long sitting member who wasn't doing anything for the community. So the community got together and the community organised around a candidate. And then when that candidate stepped down, they actually elected the next independent candidate, which was amazing.
Extraordinary. Yeah,
so
to actually hand over in that way.
Yeah, so I think that's also really interesting to see where that goes. If we can get more people even putting their hand up, even if you're not going to win, if you can use the platform to raise these issues and build community, you might not win that campaign or that particular issue, but it builds community that might win the next thing. So that's, I think, whatever it is, wherever you're at, just get involved with whatever you're comfortable with and be willing to learn and connect with other people, and you just don't know where that's going to go. Also supporting the organisations that are doing the hard work behind the scenes to be supporting people to go up front. So I think work that you do, Nicola, is so undervalued and under-resourced, but there's also Plan to Win, Holly Hammond's organisation, there's Get Up, but all of these organisations need that support and that resourcing because it's also helping to prepare and train people to be ready. But yeah, learn by doing, get involved, join a group, become a member of whatever it is that you're passionate about, and speak up and get involved, I think is what's really important. And start to learn about what's happening around the world. And we'll put some links up for you to find out more about that.
Can I throw one thing in? Yeah, just I think that local council is really undervalued as a way of making change, and it's not for me. Like my work does. I'm putting my focus on the outside of the political system, but I think a lot of people don't realise that like there's actually some really fundamental change that can happen. It's the most accessible part of government, and just getting involved and going in and seeing what your local council is doing, then thinking about running, it is actually possible to get elected to local council in, you know, without heaps of resources. And there's like quite significant changes that can happen and catalyze bigger change at a level. For example, you know, a lot of the discussion around, you know, changing the date of, you know, Invasion Day. You know, obviously Aboriginal people have been talking about it for decades, but one of the things that helped catalyse it in the mainstream is, you know, my local council here in Fremantle, you know, decided to put celebrations on a different day. And so, you know, there's huge things in terms of sustainability and climate as well. So, yeah, like that is an accessible way of getting involved in politics that might be someone's jam.
Yeah, just to give you, we're running out of time, I'm going to give you this example where I dragged myself to a community consultation when the G20 was happening in Brisbane back in, when was it, 2014. And the council was presenting it as all this new green, everything was going to be, they were going to, it was the green event. They were sort of talking about the green credentials. And they were having this massive light show every night that was using huge amounts of electricity. So I very innocently, not intentionally, just put up my hand and said, I'm just really interested, like, with your emissions. How are you offsetting them? And the guy up the front just went completely pale and looked really embarrassed and didn't have an answer. And he actually came up to me afterwards and went, oh my God, you're so right. I'm like, you're really not offsetting your emissions. And he's like, where do I go? And I was like, oh, I'll find out for you. I don't know which companies there are. And I got back to him, and that actually ended up with a policy that now all the events for Brisbane City Council they offset their emissions. It's a tiny example, but it was me asking a question in a community forum, and I think we forget that. We just don't think that they have all the answers, because often they don't. And it's not just the pressure, it's turning up and saying, hey, have you thought about doing this differently, and then organising to get that to happen. So on that note, I just want to thank both of you for coming, and I want to let everybody know a few announcements. So 2040 community screenings are now going live. So if you're interested in that, get to What's Your 2040 is the website, and contact people like Bree, who's helping us out with these chats, and they'll help you organise a community screening. The 20th of September is an easy first step if you want to get involved in something important and stand up for the climate. Is the School Strike for Climate is organising a strike for everybody. So it's not just the kids that are getting out on the street on the 20th of September, it is everybody. So you can sign up now to get involved in that and turn up. And it's a lot of fun. So if you're scared of this sort of stuff, it's a really good event to go to, because it is just so much fun, and it's so heartening and hopeful thing to be involved in. The next conversation that we'll be having, we've got 4 more to go. So the topics that we're going to be covering off on for the 2040 conversations are food justice. So we started a little bit on that in the agriculture, but we really want to talk about food issues in Australia. Waste issues that came up in the film. Gender and climate change, where are we at with that? And then the final one, we're going to be looking at how do we move from despair when it all gets a bit much, when you're trying to do all this stuff and you keep hitting walls. How do you move past that into that and keep that space of that hopeful action going? Like, how do we not burn out? How do we keep that hope alive and move forward? We're going to have some great people from Psychologists for a Safe Climate, and hopefully Holly Hammond, who I mentioned before, helping us out with that one. So there's more to come. We're going to take a small break and we'll be back in mid-September. So please keep an eye out on the Facebook page and the email list to know when the date for the next one is going to be, because we're just shaking up the date a little bit, and we're going to give it a little bit of time to really promote the chats. Please share the recordings of this one. This will be up tomorrow. We'll put all those links there. Share it widely with people, because we're getting a lot of interest from people who can't make the chat live but do want to follow up on it. So share it throughout your networks, and hopefully you can put all of what you're learning into practice. Let us know what you're doing on the Facebook page, and hopefully we'll see you in a few weeks' time. Thanks, Nicola, and thanks, Tim, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
See ya.
Bye.